Hey everyone, my name's Jackie Dang. I'm an educational developer here at Toronto Metropolitan University. I work at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. And today we're going to be talking about quantitative methods in SoTL. So SoTL stands for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And specifically, we'll be talking about using surveys and questionnaires in your SoTL work. I'm coming to you from Toronto, which is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound these peoples to share the land, share the territory, and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, all newcomers, including myself, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. If you're curious about the land in which you live and work on, I encourage you to check out nativeland.ca, which is linked, the first link down below here. The Yellowhead Institute is an institute here at TMU that focuses on Indigenous policy, Standing Strong Task Force here at TMU, and we also have some resources here related to Indigenous education at TMU. This workshop can be counted toward the Excellence in Teaching Program, or ETP, which is designed to provide faculty and contract lecturers with opportunities to enhance the impact of their teaching and participate in a community of educators committed to excellence in teaching and learning. Through the ETP, folks get to design and redesign courses and learning experiences, collaborate with colleagues and center staff, and receive recognition for professional development in teaching, as well as participate in a supportive community of educators and mentors. So it's a great opportunity for you to really bolster your teaching experience, your portfolio, your skills, and to connect with those of us at the center who really want to support you in enhancing your teaching and learning, or enhancing your teaching and supporting students' learning. Like I said, my name's Jackie. I hold a PhD focused in chemistry education research from the University of Ottawa. I'm an educational developer here at the center. So the CELT, the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, where I specifically specialize in program evaluation and the scholarship of teaching and learning. Prior to my time here at the center, I've led national and international projects focused on improving and studying equity, diversity, and inclusion, so EDI in science education, and research. And I also currently serve as an associate editor for the Canadian Journal for the Scholarship for Teaching and Learning, so CanJ SoTL. For those of you who may not have attended the earlier workshops in this series of workshops that we've been hosting, this is a workshop series focused on the scholarship of teaching and learning, so SoTL. SoTL projects are projects that focus on improving student learning and educational experiences. They involve students as partners in inquiry and learning related to student learning and teaching. They're guided by questions, oftentimes research questions that are grounded in the local context, local problems, local questions, and current knowledge. They're conducted using sound and ethical methods, which we'll talk about today. One of the key tenets of SoTL, in addition to the four that I've already mentioned, is that it doesn't become scholarship unless you share it. And so sharing your findings with others, including both researchers and educators, is sort of a paramount component of SoTL. And SoTL projects also include a clearly defined research lens. This is largely because SoTL is so multidisciplinary. Teaching and learning happens in any discipline that you can think of. And so it's important for us when we do SoTL to really clearly define what we define as research. So this is a nice graphic from the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning that really highlights the six tenets I've talked about on the left. So SoTL seeks to improve educational experiences through a focus on teaching and learning that is guided by student partnership, ethically grounded in the local context, and in which the learning from the projects are shared with others. And one thing that is not mentioned in the points on the left is that equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility also are key or central to SoTL. Again, this is a series of workshops that we've been hosting at the CELT. And so there was a workshop in November on an introduction to the scholarship of teaching and learning, followed by designing impactful SoTL research questions and methods, qualitative methods in SoTL, where we talked about interviews and focus groups. And then today we'll be talking about quantitative methods. So, what are we going to be talking about today specifically? By the end of this session, you'll be able to compare quantitative and qualitative methods to determine when quantitative approaches are useful in subtle research. You'll be able to identify and reflect on key assumptions underlying quantitative methods. And thirdly, you'll apply best practices for designing effective questionnaires to collect quantitative data. This workshop is about 45 minutes long, and it's kind of difficult, I think. I guess when I was putting this together, I thought I would try and explain statistics through this workshop. But because this is only going to be 45 minutes long, I've chosen not to really dive into stats too much today. I actually view I guess the approach of quantitative approaches to SoTL research to be distinct from sort of the statistics side of things. Obviously, I mean, there's overlap, and statistics is important or can be important in quantitative methods. But I would say it'd be difficult for me to try and explain every part of statistics through a single workshop. And so, if you're interested in learning more about statistics, um, sort of the more data analysis side of things. Um, I encourage you to check out some of these resources and tools. So Excel is, I guess, the most basic and um, the tool that we're probably most familiar with in academia when it comes to just doing basic statistical analysis. If you want to do some more complex stats in your work, you're welcome to check out SPSS. This is a statistics software tool that's available to both TMU faculty and students via computing communication services for free. So you can download that, and it's a way for you to sort of do statistics by just clicking a few buttons and making sure that your data, I guess, fits with the model that you're trying to use. If you're not sure if the stats that you're doing are correct and just want to learn more about stats, these are some really foundational resources that I've really enjoyed and relied on over the years. As someone who was not trained in statistics myself and sort of had to learn on my own, Andy Field's textbook, Discovery Statistics using IBM SPSS Statistics is really a good entry-level text. And then UCLA's Advanced Research Computing, I guess, department has a website on statistical methods and data analytics that really does a good job, I think, of sort of walking people through why you might use certain stats tests over others, and also shares some examples of how you do those different types of tests in SPSS. Some more advanced approaches or advanced tools, I would say, are Studio and Stata. These require some programming knowledge, and so um, I really haven't played around too much with these tools. I've usually just stuck with SPSS because that's been able to do all the things I've needed to do in terms of stats. But if you are curious, there are these more advanced tools out there. Again, I'm not an expert in stats, but um, and so this workshop isn't going to be diving too much into the stat side of things, but if you are curious, I'm always happy to support you and connect you with resources and folks who might know more. So let's dive right in. We're going to be talking about quantitative versus qualitative methods and determine when quantitative approaches are useful. And so I like to start off with this with an example. If I were to ask everyone, uh, this is a recording. If I were to ask everyone in the room what your favorite coffee shop is and just sort of ask you to type out the answer. These are some of the responses that we might get through this open text process. We have some neighborhood coffee shops. We have one person who really likes Arabica. One person really likes Balzac's. Another person likes Saving Gigi's, DeMello, Balzac's, and then Arabica in Eaton Center. So with these more open-ended responses, what we are really able to do is get a vast diversity of perspectives, and we're really opening up the conversation for the participants, right? We're giving them an opportunity to voice what they think their favorite coffee shop is. And it also allows us to, give them the freedom to sort of input perspectives that we may not be able to get if we were just constructing a more fixed response question. So this is an example of a qualitative question, right? We're giving people an opportunity to really express themselves without uh, uh, very many limits, right? We're giving them an open text box. They're able to type in whatever they want. One thing that qualitative responses are great at, as I have mentioned, is that again, you give people the freedom to talk about what they want. It gives you, as the a researcher, an opportunity to really explore. But one thing they're really bad at is quantifying data. If I wanted to quantify, um, I mean, this is only 7 responses here, but let's say there were 300 responses. If I wanted to quantify the number of people who said Arabica, it might take a bit of time because some people might say Arabica, someone else might say percent Arabica, and so I would have to clean up the data manually to sort of get a sense of the numbers. That's where quantitative questions can be really, really useful. So if I asked um, a multiple choice question, or it's the same question but in the multiple choice format, so a bit more of a fixed response question, and I give these 4 options: Balzac's, Tim Hortons, Starbucks, and Jimmy's Coffee. You can see here that it's really, really easy for me to quantify how many people like Balzac's versus Tim Hortons. I don't have to really clean the data. I don't really have to dive into it, dive into the text and extract sort of the key ideas. I can just see the data right in front of me. So that's really the beauty of quantitative approaches, is that they're really great at quantifying perspectives, beliefs, um, levels of knowledge, etc., um, in ways that are much more cumbersome when you employ a qualitative type of question or approach. And so, to really hammer this point home, quantitative approaches to research are interested in testing and examining relationships between specific numerical variables. And so, the goal of quantitative approaches is really to get at the breadth of data as opposed to diving into depth. And an example of a quantitative approach is administering a questionnaire with, Likert scale questions, multiple choice questions, etc. Qualitative approaches are aimed to explore people's underlying experiences, behaviors, beliefs, etc. And here we're really interested in depth as opposed to breadth. And so an example of this, as we've talked about in the previous workshop, would be an interview or a focus group. So an example of an approach would be, or a type of question, a type of quantitative, or an example of a question that could lead to a very interesting quantitative project could be: how does an in-class case study activity impact students' motivation levels? And so a quantitative approach to this question could be administering an in-class questionnaire to probe students' motivation levels before and after the in-class case study activity. And so this way you get to sort of quantitatively measure where students are at their baseline prior to the case study activity, and then you can compare that to how they report in the questionnaire after the case study activity. A qualitative approach could be doing interviews with 10 students about how the case study activity impacted their motivation. And so what I think I'm trying to illustrate here is that the same questions can be addressed using either quantitative or qualitative approaches. Um, it's really just a matter of what might be feasible for you, what you might be interested in specifically as the researcher. And so the key points I want to hammer home here is this I think put really eloquently by Dr. Nancy Chick, who says that one approach is not necessarily better than the other. And she's talking about qualitative versus quantitative here. Each has different strengths and goals, so they should be used purposefully. That said, the multidisciplinarity of SoTL often means that the richest projects draw on this complementarity and integrate both methods to develop a fuller understanding of student learning. And so you can definitely, if you want to do a questionnaire to answer that previous question first, you can use that as a starting point, and then you're more than welcome, if you have the time, the resources, the interest, to conduct a qualitative to do like the interviews and the focus groups after that. And oftentimes you will see people do that in the research literature. They'll employ what is known as a mixed methods approach, where they do a quantitative study first and use the findings from that study to build into a qualitative study. So this is what I just said. Methods that draw on both methods to enrich and deepen understanding of a phenomenon would be a mixed methods approach. So doing a quantitative questionnaire first, and then following that with qualitative interviews based on the questionnaire data. You could also do the opposite, right? You could do the interviews first and use that to identify overarching themes that you then use to develop a quantitative questionnaire that you then administer um, to a broader sample, a larger sample. All right, let's move on to learning outcome number two, which is identifying and reflecting on key assumptions underlying quantitative methods. A question I want to pose to everyone here is, how do we know when students are learning? And so these are some of the responses. The best for what I need to teach, give them an intro homework to get them around the problem we want to solve, teach the theory to solve, give a second homework asking them to solve the problem. So sort of a pre-post approach to measuring student learning. Their faces, yeah. So getting a sense of how students are reacting to what you're teaching, reflections, how they engage in class, types of questions they ask, presentations, tests, direct assessment of their work using a rubric tied to the learning outcomes, and asking questions based on your instruction. And so I think the overarching theme from these qualitative responses is we generally use assessment to get a sense of how and what and when students are learning. And so examples of learning might include increased understanding of a concept, ability to apply knowledge to a new situation, changes in that knowledge and beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, etc. But in many cases, learning cannot be observed directly. So we have to define measures and create assessments that provide indicators, i.e., evidence of learning. In most of our classrooms, grades, a number is used to measure learning. So many of us may already be using quantitative methods because many of us employ or use grades as a measure of learning in our classrooms. And so quantitative methods in SoTL aim to measure learning numerically. So sort of the framework here is that you have a learning activity that aims to equip students with the intended learning outcome. This learning outcome can be measured with a number, or achievement of that learning outcome can be measured with a number through various indicators. And so an indicator might be something like a test, where you have different questions that seek to address the original learning outcome. So I guess my theory, let's work backwards. So if I implement something in the classroom like active learning, and I posit that that an activity is going to improve understanding of chemistry, which is the outcome, what I can do is administer some test questions that seek to address this outcome, understanding of chemistry, and I use those test questions to get to generate a grade and number that serves as a proxy or a measure of understanding of chemistry. Similarly, if I'm interested in motivation, so the same activity, active learning, I think my hypothesis is that it affects motivation. I can design some questions that seek to measure motivation and turn it into some sort of score or grade. And so there are a few assumptions here in this model. First assumption is that the activity impacts the outcome, which may or may not be true. Right? I mean, if someone experiences an increase in their understanding of chemistry, um, it may be active learning contributing to that increased understanding, but it may also be a myriad of other factors. Assumption number two is that indicators are representative of the outcome. This is um, sort of a key assumption in test design is that the questions that you're asking on your test are actually measuring the thing that you want to measure, which may or may not be true. And so there are various ways that you can, what is known as validity, increase the validity of the data that you generate from specific test questions. But that over in the end, it is still an assumption that you're making. And then lastly, assumption number three, the criteria used to translate indicators into numbers are valid and objective. So who's to say that, if this test question is worth 10%, this test question is worth 80%, and this last question is worth 10% as well. Who's to say that those are, combined together representative of a number that accurately and with validity represents a true change in understanding of chemistry? All right. So what we can do to help justify our claims and justify the assumptions that we're making is draw on theory and evidence every step of the way. Your theoretical context is sort of the first place to start with this. When you conceive of your SoTL study, collect the data and analyze the data, your thoughts and decisions are most likely guided by theories or models related to learning. These provide the framework for your work, the quote unquote structure explaining the concepts and premises. As Grant and Osanlu state, this theoretical framework consists of the selected theory or theories that undergirds your thinking with regards to how you understand and plan to research your topic, as the concepts and definitions from that theory that are relevant to your topic. If your reader understands your theoretical framework, they will have a deeper understanding of your work, the decisions you made, and why you made them. So I think this really relates to that first assumption that we make, which is whether the activity is related to the outcome, right? If you can justify how active learning might enhance motivation, and draw on some theory and recent literature or other research to justify that position, you're off to a great start. Um, this is really important because numbers, I mean, I think I come from a STEM background myself, and I was trained to believe that numbers are the most objective thing that we can work with as data. But numbers themselves are not neutral. We assign meaning to numbers largely based on assumptions and theories, which depend largely on our experiences, knowledge, and biases as scholars. So it's important to be explicit about your theoretical assumptions and decisions. It helps when consider and communicate assumptions about learning, decide what variables will be measured, and test the validity and reliability of instruments. I guess another example would be, if I'm saying that these test questions I've developed are related to motivation or students' understanding of chemistry, it's important for me to be able to collect and demonstrate through data, through theory, through existing literature, that the test questions I've developed um, can reasonably I guess, be argued that they represent the thing I'm trying to measure, whether it be motivation, understanding of chemistry, what have you. So the last part of this workshop will be focusing on applying best practices for designing effective questionnaires to collect quantitative data. There are a few sources of quantitative data in SoTL research, or a few common sources. We'll be talking about questionnaires in this section, but I did want to share some other approaches. The first is institutional data, and so you might be interested in your work in collecting things like student demographic data, so data on students' race and ethnicity, gender, age, etc. Student performance, so GPA grades like we've talked about, and then learning management system data may also be available to you. So things like video watching behaviors, number/length of discussion board posts, etc. There's also course-based data, so students might submit an indicator of learning through course assignments, projects, and exams, and you might use this to turn it into a score using a set criteria or rubric. But like we've talked about, there might be some variability um, or assumptions made in terms of how that criteria or rubric are created or applied to generate a value. Lastly, there is self-report data, and so this is where questionnaires come to play. Questionnaires in which students self-report their perceptions, experiences, opinions, etc. While questionnaires are very common, they are not, I guess, immune to many forms of bias or limitations. Questionnaires are prone to participants who forget. Participants may also respond in ways that are where they seek to be more socially desirable, or they may respond in ways that they view as socially desirable, so they might, make uh, respond in very euphemistic ways or avoid contentious topics. Um, and lastly, I think the most critical for SoTL work, where we're often interested in student learning, is that perceptions of learning may not always equal actual learning, and this is a claim that is backed up by quite a bit of research. And so it's important to be mindful about, the biases that students and respondents can bring to questionnaires. Not to say that these are an ineffective tool. I think they can be a very powerful tool because of their the ease in which you're able to gather a large amount of data for data analysis. But it's important to be mindful and consider triangulating with other data as well. So employing some qualitative methods, maybe drawing on some of these other data sources up above here. Um, just a quick I guess aside on terminology, so surveys versus questionnaires. Surveys are the overall research approach where you collect data from a sample to make inferences about the population. I like to think of this in terms of like ecological surveys. I have a few friends who work in conservation, and they do surveys all the time, but their surveys don't necessarily involve a questionnaire. They're going out into like a plot of land and surveying that land to make inferences about the broader, I guess, ecosystem that they're working in. Questionnaires are the specific tool, the instrument for data collection. They're often used in survey approaches to research because they are efficient ways to gather large amounts of data. So it's an easier or an efficient way to gather a large sample, gather data from a large sample. Quantitative research designs can take many forms. And so we have um, survey design, which measures or describes trends within a large population. And so you're really just trying to get a sense of, perspectives at a one single point in time within the population. So an example would be, let's say you're doing polling for an upcoming election, and you're just trying to describe trends or patterns within a large sample or population. What are the preferences and perceptions of TMU students regarding online versus in-person learning? Could be an example of a survey approach. Correlational design was when you're measuring the degree of association between or among different variables, and so class size, learning strategies, etc. Uh, so an example could be what is the relationship between class size and student engagement in TMU courses? And so maybe you do a questionnaire that aims to measure student engagement, and then you correlate that with each class's class size. That might be an interesting study. Um, And then experimental design measures the impact of an instructional intervention on a group by comparing to a group not experiencing the intervention, known as a control. And so, does game-based learning improve mathematics achievement among TMU students compared to traditional instruction? And so, in this approach, what you would be doing is employing game-based learning in one course or one section of a course, and then comparing that to traditional instruction or the control in another section of the course and seeing if mathematics achievement changes or is different between the two courses. Amongst questionnaires in SoTL, what percentage includes quantitative questions only, includes qualitative questions only, or includes both qualitative or quantitative and qualitative questions? Um, So in some recent research by some of the authors down below here, questionnaires in SoTL that are quantitative only make up about 40% of all questionnaires in SoTL. I hesitate to recommend, especially if you're starting off in SoTL, to develop a quantitative only questionnaire. So the quantitative only questionnaire would be a question that only has like fixed response questions. So things like Likert scales, multiple choice questions, checkbox questions. Basically, you're not providing any opportunity for folks, for respondents to type or express their knowledge in open ways, open and, you know, yeah, text, images, etc. The reason for that is because quantitative only questionnaires require substantial expertise and resources to develop if one wants to be confident in the validity and reliability of the data. Um, which is why 17% of other folks have tried to or have used qualitative only questionnaires. Um, and this is again opens up the opportunity for participants to express themselves more openly, but you lose the ability to ask follow-up questions um, because you're using a questionnaire, which renders other methods for qualitative data collection more useful. So things like interviews and focus groups. Overwhelmingly, or maybe not overwhelmingly, but 43% of questionnaires in SoTL employ both quantitative and qualitative. And so numerical data, so collecting quantitative data, plus some opportunities for open-ended insights from respondents. So qualitative, like text boxes, questions like, could you please elaborate on your response to the previous question, stuff like that. So it allows you to sort of get the quantitative that I guess, is easier to analyze, quote unquote, um, while also giving you the freedom to ask follow-up questions or give people opportunities to talk about things that you may not have accounted for in designing the questionnaire. Should you build your own questionnaire or use someone else's is a common question I'm asked. I like to think of this in terms of, uh, um, cooking a recipe. If you create your own questionnaire, it's kind of like you're creating your own recipe for a particular dish. You choose the ingredients, the questions, you test different combinations, pilot testing, and you refine the flavors, validating and revising to ensure it meets your specific taste, your contextual research needs. It takes much more time and effort, but you do in the end get a completely customized dish tailored to your study. You could also use an existing questionnaire, so using like a recipe that you found online, where someone has already tested it, fine-tuned the ingredients, and proven that it works. You can trust that it will likely produce reliable results, but you may need to adjust the seasoning, modify or adapt questions to fit your exact needs. And so there are pros and cons to both of these approaches. I would say, um, in general, in reality, it can be helpful to draw on both approaches as well as student feedback. So maybe you start with a question that someone's already developed out in the literature, but you take that questionnaire and you modify it slightly based on your own needs and and research questions. You may also invite students to comment on the questions in the questionnaire to make sure that they make sense in a process known as response process validity, collecting response process validity evidence, um, and that they're aligned with the things that you're trying to measure. When designing a questionnaire, it's important to keep in mind I guess, these competing um, axes of scope and length. If you have a really long questionnaire and it's limited in scope, it's going to be really unlikely, or it's going to be more, I guess, unlikely, less likely, I should say, less likely that you'll get a lot of responses because it's so long, and you'll get limited data. If you have a very short questionnaire, that makes it harder sometimes to get the scope that you want, and so you get a high response rate but limited data. If you have something that's comprehensive but long, you get again low response rate, and but the responses you do get generally are good and useful data. This is probably the quadrant that usually stuck in because I like to ask a lot of questions. I like to be very comprehensive. I have a lot of anxiety when sending out questionnaires because for me, as someone who really enjoys qualitative research methods and likes asking follow-up questions, it's very scary for me to send out the questionnaire and hope that I've covered everything. So again, there's some ways to sort of work around this by embedding qualitative type questions into your questionnaire. But again, this is a challenge. This can be a challenge. The ideal situation is a questionnaire that is really short and while still being comprehensive. And then again, this is easier said than done. But one thing that's really helped me is just knowing that um, and hearing from experts in quantitative research who are colleagues of mine talk about how, questionnaires, they're never going to be perfect. And so the best that we can do is, again, justify the questions that we're including, the questions that we're asking, and, you know, uh, being able to just sort of justify from evidence, theory, literature, that's what we're asking on these questionnaires and how we've designed this questionnaire aligns with our research goals um, and what we're trying to do. Different questions generate different data. So this is just a quick overview of the different types of data that we can, or different types of questions that we can use in questionnaires. So there's categorical data. So this would be like asking about what students' majors are. These are distinct groups with no inherent order. So asking what students' majors are, engineering, history, biology, or mode of study, online versus in person. Ordinal data is ordered categories, but the differences aren't equal. So things like letter grades, Likert scale ratings. And then continuous data is data within a range that allows for meaningful comparisons. So exam scores, time spent studying, GPA. The reason I include this slide is because the types of data that you collect are that's going to dictate the types of statistical tests that you're able to do with your data. So if you have categorical data, that's going to limit you, or that's going to sort of direct you to a specific group of statistical tests, versus if you have continuous data, that'll require a different set of stats tests as well. Again, I direct you to some of the resources I shared earlier in this presentation, including the UCLA resource if you are curious about the different stats tests and the different types of data that those tests require. Validity and reliability. Um, uh, Validity is how well a measurement reflects reality. And so, or sorry, these are, I guess, two measures that speak to how well a measurement reflects reality. Validity can be thought of as analogous to accuracy. It's whether data generated by an instrument represents the thing it's trying to measure. Should have filled that in. And reliability is akin to precision, whether the same instrument produces the same result over time or over measures. Anytime we want to turn an observation into a number, there will always be a certain amount of uncertainty or error. And so it's important for us to do things, engage in some processes that ensure that what we're gathering is a valid and reliable measure of what we're actually trying to measure. So one thing that we can do to evaluate the validity of the questionnaire is do something called expert review, where we just send the questionnaire to experts to assess clarity, relevance, and validity of the questions we're asking. So if I'm interested in measuring motivation, um, I could send my questionnaire to some folks who are working in motivation research and ask them to evaluate my questionnaire for feedback. We can engage in something called response process validation. And so this is sharing your questionnaire with some potential or representatives of the respondent sample, and then asking them how they interpret and answer the questions. And then pilot testing, doing a small scale trial to test the questions and see if they're functioning in ways that you intended for them to function. I would say of these two, or of these three, sorry, of these three, these might be the most feasible. Pilot testing can take a long time, right? It's basically doing a small scale version of your study. So if you're pressed for time and resources, definitely encourage you doing some sort of expert review, or even just doesn't have to be an expert, can just be someone that you're working with even, just to get a second perspective, and then response process validation. For quantitative studies, there are a few ethical considerations, just like qualitative studies or any sort of research involving human beings. It's important that participants are participating voluntarily, so that they understand they can withdraw at any time without consequence. Anonymity and confidentiality are also essential. So using unique identifiers instead of personal information and presenting results in aggregate to protect identities. Privacy, collecting data through secure anonymous questionnaires, or controlled experiments to minimize exposure of personal details. Clearly outlining any potential risks, for example, mild survey fatigue, and emphasizing any societal or personal benefits of participating. Providing a clear description of the data collection process, for example, questionnaire completion, experimental tasks, or secondary data usage. The nature of an incentive, if you're offering one, offering appropriate incentives like a small monetary compensation or entry into a prize draw at levels that avoid coercion. And then also including details on who to contact for the researcher and ethics review board for any questions or concerns. These are all things that you should think about and include in a consent form, and these are all questions that you'll have to address, or sorry, topics that you'll have to address if you do need to go through a research ethics board application for your project. So to summarize, quantitative research helps us to explore how much, for example, to what extent students achieve learning outcomes, engage with instructional materials, or demonstrate proficiency in a given subject. But it's important to recognize that numbers are not neutral, so we need to be able to justify our claims about what numbers represent, drawing on established theories and existing research. So if we're using a questionnaire to measure motivation, we need to be able to justify to others, for example, if we're sharing the work with others in the publication, why the questions that we're asking in this questionnaire are representative of the construct that we're trying to measure. Questionnaires are just one tool for quantitative studies. There's no perfect questionnaire, but best practices include drawing on the existing questionnaires, clear wording, balancing length and scope, getting feedback from students and experts, and using a mix of closed and open-ended questions. I developed this workshop through consultation of these various resources. John W. Cresswell's textbook on educational research, planning, conducting, and evaluating quantitative and qualitative research is not just a great resource for quantitative approaches to research, but just educational research in general if you're getting started. The standards for educational and psychological testing is sort of the holy grail or the um, of um, of developing tests in education or questionnaires in education. And so if you're curious about some of the more nitty-gritty details of validity, reliability, and building a really robust and rigorous questionnaire, um, definitely check out or grab a copy of the standards book. And then SoTL research methodologies um, by Michelle Yeoh, Janice Miller-Young, and Karen Manarin. Really gives a great overview of different approaches that you might employ in SoTL. So it includes quantitative approaches, but also includes qualitative approaches and mixed methods approaches. Lastly, I encourage you to share some feedback on our workshops. So this workshop, but also any other workshops that you've attended with the CELT this past year. Um, Again, this is the first time we're hosting these SoTL workshops, and I know that there's going to be room for improvement. So if you have any feedback, more than happy to hear it. And if you also just want to send me an email directly, my email is Jackie Dang. My name's so Jackie Dang at torontomu.ca. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful, and I wish you all the best in your SoTL journey.